Black Hollow was the kind of village you didn't find on a map. It was tucked deep within the folds of mist-covered hills and dense ancient woods that seemed to breathe in unison with the wind. Time moved slower there, and every stone, every crooked tree, every shadow, felt older than memory itself. People didn't move to Black Hollow. They were either born into it or had the misfortune of wandering too far off the main road and never quite leaving. Evelyn Hart wasn't superstitious. She was a folklore student at university, fascinated by old myths and regional ghost stories. But to her, they were just that, stories, fiction dressed in history. So when she found records of Black Hollow and its long-forgotten legends, she was intrigued. A perfect place to base her final thesis. She wanted authenticity. She wanted the eerie, the isolated, the atmospheric. Black Hollow offered all three. The locals weren't welcoming. The woman at the only general store barely looked up from her till when Evelyn asked for directions. An old man sweeping outside his porch watched her with cloudy eyes, muttering something under his breath when she passed. She didn't mind. Rural towns often distrusted outsiders. She assumed it was just their way. She had rented a small, run-down cottage at the edge of the village. It was the only place available, and suspiciously cheap. The listing had described it as quaint, private, full of character. It was, in truth, weather-beaten, and surrounded by thick forest on three sides. The paint peeled like shedding. Skin and ivy crept up the crumbling stone like fingers reaching for escape. When she arrived, the key was already under the mat. No one came to greet her. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. Dust motes swirled through beams of sunlight like restless spirits. The silence was unnerving. Not peaceful, unnerving. Even the birds outside seemed to avoid the cottage, and the forest stood unnaturally still. Later that evening, as she unpacked, a woman knocked on her door. Wrinkled skin, cloudy eyes, and a voice like wind dragging across a grave. "You shouldn't be here after dark," she warned without introduction. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" The woman hesitated, then looked past Evelyn into the cottage like she could see something Evelyn couldn't. "The house listens. That's all I'll say." Before Evelyn could ask anything else, the woman turned and shuffled down the path, swallowed again by the village that didn't want to be known. Night fell quickly in Black Hollow. The sky turned to ink and the trees became silhouettes of claws. Evelyn sat at her desk, flipping through old local archives she had printed, trying to ignore how every creak in the floor seemed too deliberate. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal. Inside, the silence grew heavier, like a pressure on her chest. At around 10:30, she heard scratching. It came from the walls, not from one spot but from multiple directions, like something was moving inside the very bones of the house, mice maybe, or rats. She made a mental note to ask for traps in the morning. Then came the whispers. So faint she thought it was the wind at first, but when she muted her music, the sound remained. Soft, muttering voices. Unintelligible, like someone speaking from behind a thick curtain. She pressed her ear to the wall. Nothing. The second she moved away, the whispers returned. She laughed nervously and shook her head. Long drive, creepy old house. Probably just her mind playing tricks. The moment she stood up to go to bed, her phone screen flickered and died. She had just charged it an hour ago. The battery had been full. The lights dimmed, then buzzed, and then held steady. But the air changed. The warmth from earlier had vanished, replaced by a damp cold that made her skin prickle. She could see her breath in front of her, faint and fog-like, and then she heard it. A child's voice. Soft, close. Too close. "Why are you in my room?" She froze. Her blood ran cold, and her eyes darted around the empty living room. The voice had come from behind her, inches away. She turned quickly, her breath catching. No one. She stood there alone, heart pounding. The cottage was silent again. The lights buzzed softly overhead, but Evelyn knew what she had heard, and worse, she knew that whatever had spoken was still there. The morning light did little to ease Evelyn's nerves. It crept lazily through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the floorboards like dark fingers reaching inward. She hadn't slept. Not really. She had spent most of the night, sitting upright in bed, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything to move. But nothing had. Just the whisper of wind outside and the echo of that child's voice in her memory. She convinced herself that sleep deprivation was to blame, that she had imagined it. Hallucinated, maybe. The human brain could do strange things when it felt isolated, but a quiet doubt still lingered, gnawing at the edge of her thoughts like something alive. After making herself a weak cup of coffee with the half-functioning kettle, Evelyn decided to investigate the house more thoroughly. There had to be some explanation for the whispers. Maybe pipes in the walls or a vent carrying voices from outside. Something rational. She started with the guest bedroom, the one she hadn't used. It was smaller than hers, mostly empty except for a rusted iron bed frame, an old dresser, and a rolled-up carpet in the corner. The room felt colder than the others. The air inside was strangely still, heavy, like the room had been sealed shut for years. Something drew her attention to the carpet. The edges were frayed and discolored, but beneath it, the wooden floor seemed darker, as if stained. She knelt down and pulled the carpet aside, revealing a strange scorched symbol burned into the wood. It was a twisted, eye-shaped design surrounded by symbols she didn't recognize. Sharp lines, spirals, ancient-looking patterns. It looked ritualistic. Deliberate, not something you stumbled on by accident. She snapped a photo with her camera and tried to send it to her professor, but once again, her phone refused to connect. No bars, no Wi-Fi, no explanation. Evelyn spent the rest of the day researching the symbol in her notes and books. She compared it with old Celtic runes, Druidic symbols, even early pagan markings. But nothing matched exactly. The symbol was unique, at least unique enough that it had no public record she could find. It only deepened her unease. As evening approached, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with a hollow moaning sound. She tried to distract herself with music, but the speakers crackled and died after a few seconds. She turned on a lamp instead and sat quietly, reading. But around 9 p.m., the whispers returned. This time, they were clearer. She couldn't make out exact words, but there was a rhythm, like chanting, low and droning, almost beneath the range of hearing. It came from the walls again, then from the floor beneath her. The voices didn't sound angry now. They sounded expectant. Something was building. At 2:13 a.m. she woke suddenly, her heart hammering in her chest. She was no longer in bed. She was on the living room floor, curled in a fetal position, the wood beneath her slick with cold sweat. Her hands were bruised and dirty, and in her right hand she clutched something. It was a small wooden doll. It looked hand-carved, old, rough, maybe from a child's toy set decades ago. Its face was crude, but its eyes were hollow, deep pits that seemed to absorb the light. Its mouth had been stitched shut with coarse black thread. She dropped it immediately, her skin crawling. Then came the knocks, not at the door, but inside the walls. 1, 2, 3. They echoed through the cottage, slow and deliberate. Then silence. Then, as if pulled by some invisible string, the attic door at the top of the staircase creaked open. She stared at it. Her instincts screamed to stay where she was, to not move, to pretend none of this was happening. But something, curiosity, fear, pride, drew her to her feet. She grabbed her flashlight and made her way up the stairs, each creaking step heavier than the last. The attic was mostly empty, just exposed beams, a few cobweb-covered boxes, and an old mirror standing against the far wall. She lifted her flashlight and froze. Her reflection was standing there, but it was smiling. Evelyn was not. The reflection blinked once, slowly, then raised its hand and pointed, directly behind her. Her breath caught in her throat, her body locked in place. She didn't want to turn. She didn't want to see what it was pointing at, but something compelled her, a cold, sinking dread that moved like ice through her veins. She turned slowly. What she saw didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. There, etched into the wooden beams behind her, were hundreds of tiny scratches. Names, dozens, maybe more, written again and again into the wood, like someone had clawed them into the house in desperation. And at the very top, freshly carved, still bleeding, Evelyn Hart. Then everything went black. Evelyn awoke to the sound of birds. Bright morning sunlight filtered through the cracks in the attic roof, warm and golden. For a moment, everything felt normal, until she sat up and realized she was still on the floor, still in the attic. The mirror was gone. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and her hands were streaked with dry blood. Not hers. The names on the wall remained. Her own name, still fresh, had darkened with age overnight, as if time inside the attic ran differently. She stumbled down the stairs in a daze, barely noticing the way the walls seemed to breathe around her. The living room was colder than before, as if something had been let in. The doll lay exactly where she had dropped it, facing the stairs. She decided she had to leave. Grabbing her backpack and camera, she rushed out into the morning sun. But the village was wrong. Houses that had been shuttered before were now wide. Open, windows cracked and curtains billowing, though no one was inside. The general store was dark. The streets were empty. Not a single villager in sight. Not even the birds made a sound anymore. Evelyn reached the main road and found it gone. The path she had driven in on was now just thick forest, no tire tracks, no sign it had ever existed. Panic surged through her as she tried to retrace her steps, hiking for what felt like hours through the trees. But she always came back, to the house, to Black Hollow. By sunset, exhausted and shaking, she returned to the cottage, because there was nowhere else to go. The moment she stepped inside, the whispers resumed, no longer shy, no longer distant. They surrounded her. They spoke her name. They laughed. She found herself in the guest room again, kneeling before the burned symbol without. Realizing how she had gotten there, her hands moved on their own, tracing the edges of the twisted eye with her fingertips. Her voice joined the whispers, speaking in a language she had never learned. And then, silence. A deep, unnatural stillness. A moment later, a knock at the door. Not from within the walls this time, but from outside. She opened it. A girl stood there. Young, around 20. Backpack, camera, phone in hand. She smiled nervously. "Hi, I'm Evelyn Hart. I think I've rented this place?" The Evelyn who answered the door only smiled back. Cold, empty. Behind her, the whispering began again, and in the woods surrounding Black Hollow, the trees rustled with quiet laughter.